The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and for a moment, time fractured. Emma stepped inside, mop in hand, unaware she'd entered the top floor of Manhattan's most secretive billionaire. The penthouse shimmered in gold and glass, a world that didn't belong to her. She just needed to clean and leave before anyone noticed. But when a man's voice broke the silence, low, controlled, and startled, everything shifted. "Who are you?" he asked. He froze, her reflection trembling in the marble. The man before her wasn't angry. He was stunned, as if he'd seen a ghost he didn't know he'd lost. Emma stammered an apology, her words colliding into one another like broken glass. Adrian watched her. Not the mop, not the uniform, but the tremor in her voice, the defiance hidden under fear. He told her it was fine, that mistakes happen, but something in his tone betrayed curiosity. He'd spent years surrounded by perfection, and now, for the first time, imperfection had a heartbeat. She hurried to finish her job, pretending not to feel his gaze. Every sweep of the mop echoed like thunder in her chest. Adrian turned to his reflection in the window, but all he saw was her. Small, determined, refusing to disappear. For a man used to people performing around him, her silence felt louder than applause. When the elevator finally opened, she pushed her cart inside, heart racing. He followed, stopping just before the threshold. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. Not out of fear, but disbelief that someone like him wanted to know. "Emma," she said softly. The doors closed, leaving him alone with her name echoing in the silence. As Emma stepped out into the night, the city roared back to life. Streetlights flickered over wet pavement as she crossed to the subway, unaware that a man 40 floors above was still standing by the glass, whispering her name like a question he didn't know how to answer. The next morning, Adrian sat in a meeting surrounded by voices that blurred into meaningless noise. Numbers, projections, mergers. They all swam past him, weightless. He should have cared. His company's next acquisition could shift markets, but all he could see was her. The tremble of her hands, the way she refused to meet his eyes, the way she didn't seem impressed by his world. That humility had cracked something inside him he didn't know was breakable. When Nora, his chief of staff, called his name twice, he finally blinked and looked up. "Cancel my afternoon," he said, his tone low but decisive. "There's somewhere I need to be." Emma worked quietly in the cafe downtown, scrubbing counters between customers. She liked the rhythm of normalcy, the hiss of the espresso machine, the chatter of strangers. It grounded. But when the bell above the door rang and she looked up, the air changed. Adrian stood there, completely out of place amid chipped mugs and old jazz. He didn't say anything at first, just looked around like he was trying to remember what real life felt like. Then, softly, "Coffee. Black." It wasn't a command. It was a plea to belong, if only for a moment. She tried to act normal, but her hands betrayed her, trembling slightly as she poured the coffee. He noticed, of course. "You remembered my name?" she asked, voice caught between suspicion and wonder. "Hard to forget something that changed my morning," he said quietly. His words landed between them like an uninvited truth, and for the first time in years, she smiled. Small, unguarded, dangerous. Nora waited by the car outside, checking her watch, frustration simmering. Through the cafe window, she could see Adrian laughing. Something she hadn't witnessed in years. She snapped a photo discreetly, sending it to his assistant with a terse message. "Find out who she is." Inside, Adrian leaned forward, his voice low. "Do you always hide in places like this?" Emma shrugged. "Only where people forget to look." He smiled, but she didn't. That night, Emma replayed the day on the subway home. It didn't feel real. The richest man she'd ever met, sitting across from her like an equal. But as the train rattled through tunnels, she caught her reflection in the dark window and whispered to it, Don't be stupid. Somewhere across the city, Adrian lay awake in a glass room that felt colder than ever, scrolling through the photo Nora had sent him of Emma's staff file. He should have deleted it, but didn't. Instead, he stared at her name again, as if memorizing something forbidden. Days passed, but neither could retreat from the echo of that cafe. Adrian began showing up more often, always with a reason too flimsy to justify itself. A meeting nearby, a craving for real coffee, each visit chipped away at Emma's walls. He'd ask about her day, her dreams, the life she'd lived before survival became her only goal. At first, she deflected, wary of his curiosity. But one morning, when the cafe was quiet and sunlight painted golden stripes across the floor, she told him about the apartment she lost, the art she never finished, the silence she'd learned to live with. He didn't interrupt. He just listened, something no one had done in years. Nora's patience thinned by the hour. Reports were piling, investors waiting, and Adrian, the man she'd built her career protecting, was now late for meetings, lost in coffee cups and conversations that didn't belong to his world. She's a distraction, Nora warned him one night, cornering him in the elevator. You don't know anything about her. Adrian's reply was soft, but sharp enough to slice through her loyalty. That's the point. The doors closed, leaving Nora staring at her reflection, realizing the empire she managed was slipping into someone else's hands or heart. Emma began noticing small things, the way other employees stared when Adrian appeared, the whispers that trailed after he left. One afternoon, her manager pulled her aside. Is this a thing? He asked awkwardly, gesturing toward the window where Adrian's car idled again. Her cheeks flushed. No, he's just being kind. But kindness, she realized, was rare currency in a world that always demanded payment. As Adrian entered, heads turned. For the first time, Emma felt the weight of being seen, and it terrified her. Later that night, Adrian invited her to a private charity gala, just to help serve. Nothing more, he said. But when she arrived, he was waiting by the entrance, abandoning the crowd to greet her. The room sparkled with diamonds and glass, and she felt the sharp divide between their worlds. Yet, when he extended his hand to steady her nerves, something shifted. For a moment, it wasn't a billionaire and a worker. It was two people quietly defying gravity. Cameras flashed, whispers rippled. But in that still moment, they didn't care. When the night ended, he offered her a ride home. They didn't speak much. The city outside the car blurred into streaks of silver and neon. At her building, she turned to thank him, but his gaze lingered. Not lustful, not possessive, just searching. You make this world feel real again, he murmured. She wanted to tell him that his world could never be real for someone like her. But instead, she opened the door and stepped out into the rain, leaving his words to echo in the dark. The bell over the cafe door chimed, and the past walked in wearing damp denim and a grin that meant trouble. He didn't order. He dropped a bulging folder onto the counter. Paper corners splayed like broken wings. Thought you'd want to see what your miracle man builds, he said, voice too loud for the soft room. Maps, memos, stamped signatures, blocks of their old streets parceled into neat rectangles. The word acquisition repeated like a prayer without mercy. She tried to laugh it off, but the sound died against the hiss of steam and the weight of eyes turning. He leaned close, breath of rain and resentment. They didn't just buy buildings, they bought silence. She stared at the logo she'd never noticed before, a small mark in the corner that felt like a nail driven through memory. The cup in her hand rattled against the saucer, porcelain confessing what she would not. They stood at the chain-link fence where a block used to breathe, the night carrying the tinny clatter of loose metal and the far cough of a generator. He pointed to the skeletal ribs of a half-demolished row house, naming neighbors as if conjuring ghosts. who baked on Sundays, who fought the winter with laughter, who refused to leave until the bulldozers blinked at dawn. She pressed her palms to cold wire, remembering a window that framed fireworks and summers that tasted like stolen peaches. "Did he know?" she asked, the question brittle as old paint. He shrugged with the arrogance of despair. If he didn't, it's because not knowing made him rich. Sirens slid through the wet dark. A gust lifted grit into their eyes, and for a heartbeat she saw the future they might have had if walls could survive signatures. She steeled herself, gathered the papers, and chose the only direction left, up the tower, to ask the question herself. The elevator rose like a held breath and spilled her into glass and thunder. He turned from the window. Tie loosened, surprise softening into concern as she crossed the marble, with Storm still clinging to her sleeves. She laid the papers between them, a small avalanche of harm, and asked the question without his name. "How could this be yours?" He spoke carefully, the way people talk near detonators, swearing ignorance, promising inquiry, offering a bridge built of apologies and calls he could make before midnight. Lightning stitched the city and cut their reflections into jagged pieces. She wanted to believe in the way his eyes flinched at each photograph, the way his voice lowered when the word home appeared on page 5. But belief felt like walking a slick ledge over an old wound. "If you didn't know," she said, "it's because not knowing was convenient." The silence that followed had the shape of a verdict neither of them wanted. She left him with the city raging and stepped into the quiet where machines hum and secrets travel. The doors slid open to reveal a woman waiting with an envelope so crisp it could cut skin. Polite words arrived dressed as concern, offering compensation for inconvenience. A driver to take her home, a number to call when memories soften. The subtext wore steel-toed shoes. "Take this, disappear. Let the world return to its expensive sleep." She looked at the envelope and imagined walls rising from money like flowers from salt. Then she imagined the lot behind the fence, the names the night had spoken. "Keep it," she said, voice steady enough to shame the floor. The air thinned. A warning followed, delivered with the grace of a blade. "This path bruises people like you." She pressed the elevator button with shaking fingers and met the other woman's gaze, until the doors swallowed both of their reflections. He stayed by the glass long after the thunder retreated, screens blooming with reports. He'd never bothered to read past the summaries. Subsidiaries nested inside subsidiaries, a paper labyrinth that turned blame into vapor. A name kept reappearing, unfamiliar and intimate as a scar. He called someone who owed him honesty and listened to the pause that meant the truth was heavy. Across the river, she walked beneath a slashed umbrella, city water finding its way down her collar. The folder clutched like a lifeline and a curse. The night tasted of metal and endings. Her phone vibrated with a message she wouldn't open, and then another. She typed 2 words, "Not tonight," and let the screen go dark. He drafted an apology and deleted it, drafted a promise and feared it. Somewhere between their windows, the storm left, but it had already rewritten the air they breathed. Morning arrived with teeth, a headline nailed to every screen. A grainy frame from the gala, a hand hovering too close to be innocent, a caption engineered to bruise. By noon, the cafe felt smaller, the air crowded with whispers that pretended to be concern. Orders came clipped, eyes came hungry, and someone at the corner table lifted a phone without shame, angling for proof of ruin. The manager asked for a word that meant judgment, not dialogue. Policy was recited like scripture. Fraternization was a sin that didn't require intent. She stood very still as the apron strings loosened and fell, and the room, once refuge, tilted toward exile. On the sidewalk, wind pulled at her hair, as if even the weather wanted a piece. She imagined tearing the headline in half and finding silence inside, but paper only multiplies when it's shredded. The door chimed behind her, a small sound that felt like a verdict handed down by strangers. The boardroom gathered like a storm pretending to be furniture, all glass and angles and the quiet cruelty of success. He took his seat at the end of the table and found his name written in concern on every face. Forecasts bled red across the screens, words like exposure and reputational risk handled with a surgeon's dispassion. A proposal slid forward, distance, decisive and public, a statement that converted a person into a problem solver. He spoke once, voice steady, insisting on patience, context, humanity. The room responded with the arithmetic of markets. Loyalty wore a suit and asked for signatures. Even the air felt standardized, as if empathy required an access badge he no longer possessed. When the vote concluded, a script awaited his mouth, tight and bloodless. He read the lines he did not believe, tasting metal, while the city far below continued its indifferent blinking. She emptied a locker that had never held much, 2 notebooks, a chipped mug, a key that no longer belonged anywhere. The letter used words that curled at the edges. Violation, conflict, discretion. It said she had chosen visibility and must accept the cost. She wondered when survival became theater and who sold the tickets. In the hallway, footsteps paused, then continued. The choreography of people who wanted to help without inheriting her gravity. She folded the letter until it became a hard little square and slipped it into her pocket like a stone you keep to remember a river. The exit door stuck the way it always had, and for a second she almost laughed at the fairness of something resisting everyone equally. Outside, a delivery truck hissed past and splashed her shoes. In its wake, the street looked scrubbed clean, as if erasing had always been part of the design. By dusk, the sidewalk outside her building had become a corridor of questions. Microphones thin as spears, lenses hungry and faithless. She tried to shoulder through, but conjecture has elbows. Then the car slid to the curb, sleek as a lie, and he stepped out into the static. The crowd surged, scenting narrative. He said her name. Gentle ruined, and the night brightened with flashes that turned faces into masks. He tried to carve a path with apology, but every word fed the machine that wanted spectacle over sense. A voice from the swarm tossed an accusation that landed like a stone on glass. Another asked if she enjoyed the penthouse view. She looked at him once, long enough to recognize the regret he wore like a borrowed coat, and then looked away. No rescue tonight. Only the slow, necessary craft of leaving. Night settled like ash. In a room that measured success by the echo it produced, he stood among screens tracking decline in real time, a cliff rendered in decimals. The statement had calmed no one. The architects of profit were already drafting a new floor plan that did not include his sentimentality. He walked the perimeter of glass, counting his reflections like suspects, and felt the strange weightlessness of power detaching from person. Across the river, a smaller room held a quieter inventory, a kettle rattling on a crooked burner, a stack of resumes, a phone face down to stop it from glowing. She sat with her hands around a chipped mug until warmth became pain, then set it aside. Somewhere, a siren rehearsed the city's single long note. They both memorized the sound of their separate silences and wondered how long a falling can last after the ground has already been reached. He returned to the tower before dawn and turned on every light like a confession booth, dragging the company's veins across the screens until they mapped a body with too many hands. Shell firms nested behind charities, contracts signed by ghosts who shared an office with a P.O. box, neighborhoods reduced to coordinates and profit margins. He read memos that mistook distance for innocence and felt the old armor slip from his shoulders piece by piece. When the elevator chimed, the only person who understood both the reach and the cost stepped out, jaw tight, eyes reluctant. She didn't hug him with mercy. She handed him passwords and a stack of red flags she'd saved for the day he finally asked. Together they traced the route harm had taken through signatures and silence. When the sun bled into the glass, the choice had already been made. There would be no polite meeting, no gentle pivot, only a rupture loud enough to wake the building. He called the architects of the labyrinth to a room that made men feel taller and let the doors thud shut like a verdict. They arrived rehearsed, armed with euphemisms that turned demolition into strategy and absence into plausible. He listened just long enough to recognize the choreography of evasion, then cut through it with a simple ledger of facts, dates, transfers, signatures that could not be both his and unknown to him. When anger rose from the table, it was disguised as concern for stability, for shareholders, for the delicate ecosystem of reputation. He let it flare and die against a wall of silence, then placed a folder at the center like a fuse. Regulators had already been called. Whistleblower protections had already been invoked. Severance was off the table. Restitution was on it. The room's glass turned mirror bright, reflecting faces that suddenly looked smaller. Someone reached for a legal threat and found it dull. He took the elevator down instead of up, and crossed a lobby that had always polished his reflection into something invulnerable. Outside, the city met him without ceremony, and he walked the blocks that once had names he never learned, stopping where a fence bit into the sky. Workers paused, wary. A handful of residents gathered, arms folded, faces weathered by paperwork and dust. He didn't deliver a sermon. He laid out a blueprint that replaced extraction with repair, title reversals where possible, rent forgiveness where not, an independent fund ring-fenced from profit, construction halted until a council of neighbors signed off with their own pens. He did not ask for trust. He asked for scrutiny. When a woman demanded why it had taken so long, he said the quiet answer out loud and let it hang there, heavy and unadorned. The wind carried grit through the gap where a door once stood, and he felt the sting as something like penance. By evening, cameras waited like weather. He stepped to the podium feeling the peculiar calm of a cliff you choose, not one you fall from. The statement in his pocket was brief. The long version already boxed for agencies with sharper teeth. He spoke without ornaments, naming the structures that protected harm, the people who built them, the ways he benefited from being busy enough not to look. Then he did what the room hadn't rehearsed. Offered the chair he occupied to an interim chosen by outsiders, surrendered bonuses backdated to the beginning of the damage, and pledged a binding schedule of repair with deadline. Louder than promises, questions came hot, some designed to sting, others to sanctify. He refused both, insisting the story wasn't his to headline. Flash after flash struck his eyes until tears he did not intend found their way forward. And for once, he did not hide them. Night folded the city into quieter shapes, and he climbed narrow stairs that smelled of soap and rain, carrying nothing that could be mistaken for leverage. At the landing he paused, hearing a kettle click off somewhere past thin walls, and placed a paper on the mat, proof of what had been filed, of what would be undone, of what would be built by hands that had been ignored. He didn't knock. He sat on the step opposite and let the hallway's cheap light hold him while fatigue eroded the edges of pride. When footsteps approached, he rose without reaching forward. The door opened a careful width, a silence deeper than accusation breathing between them. He said he wasn't there to be forgiven. He was there because the truth should never arrive by headline again. The paper disappeared inside. The door remained. He nodded once, accepting the country of that distance, and started down toward whatever came next. Seasons shifted like soft apologies, and the city learned new rhythms. The tower still stood, though its nameplate had changed. The cafe had moved 2 blocks closer to the park, where morning light caught steam in ribbons. She no longer hurried through her days. She owned them now. Each table, each scent of coffee and cinnamon, each customer whose story was a reminder that survival could bloom into peace. Sometimes she'd catch her reflection in the window and barely recognize the calm in her own eyes. The ache of everything that came before still whispered, but quieter now, like an echo that had finally run out of hallway. She wrote a note on the blackboard above the counter that morning. Open hearts served here. The world outside bustled on, but inside, it felt almost whole. Across town, he had become a quieter man. No motorcade, no entourage, just the slow gait of someone learning to measure days by meaning instead of meetings. The city no longer parted for him, and he found that mercy. He worked with architects and residents, rebuilding spaces where towers once promised progress, but delivered absence. At night, he'd walk through half-finished courtyards, tracing the outlines of futures that would never need his signature again. The weight he carried now was honest, shaped by consequence, softened by intent. On his desk sat a single card she'd written once. "Thank you for listening." He hadn't answered it. Some truths deserved silence more than repetition. One evening, a thunderstorm passed like memory, sudden, cleansing, brief. When the rain stopped, the cafe door chimed. She looked up from wiping a counter, expecting a stranger. He stood there, older somehow, though only months had passed, rainwater tracing his collar. They didn't speak right away. Words would have broken the fragile equilibrium of recognition. He smiled. Small, uncertain, real. And the corners of her mouth trembled towards something that felt like forgiveness, but wasn't quite there yet. She nodded toward an empty seat by the window, and he took it without hesitation. The world outside blurred to watercolor. Inside, the kettle hissed, and two unfinished lives began to warm in the same room again. He told her he'd come not to reopen wounds, but to return something that wasn't his. Her sketchbook. She'd left it behind the night she stormed out of the penthouse, pages full of charcoal dreams half smeared by tears and time. He placed it on the counter like a relic, careful not to touch her fingers. She flipped through it, silent, until a page stopped her. A half-drawn skyline. A woman cleaning windows that reached the clouds. For a moment, both smiled. "You kept it," she said softly. "No," he answered, voice low. "It kept me." The cafe clock ticked once, loud as a heartbeat, and for the first time since that night, the silence between them didn't hurt. Morning came again, brighter this time. He was gone before the cafe opened, leaving only the sketchbook on the table and a folded note inside. "You were never part of my empire. You were the reason I left it behind." She read it twice, then looked toward the window, where the city stretched wide and alive. She didn't chase him. She didn't need to. Some stories don't end in possession. They end in peace. She turned the sign on the door from closed to open, the bell chiming like a new beginning. Outside, sunlight caught the rain-soaked pavement, and somewhere in the noise of the waking city, two lives continued. Parallel, healed, human.